When 10-year-old Tommy stepped onto that Atlantic City stage in 1975 to sing My Way, he had no idea that Frank Sinatra himself was listening from backstage next door. As the crowd's cruel laughter grew louder and the boy's voice began to crack, an extraordinary moment unfolded that would change both their lives forever. But what did Frank whisper in Tommy's ear that night that made the boy break down in tears? And why did Sinatra give him the one thing he never gave to anyone else? The Golden Nugget Casino's backstage area thrummed with the familiar energy of another sold-out show. Frank Sinatra stood before the mirror in his dressing room, adjusting the bow tie of his black tuxedo with practiced precision. At 60, his movements bore the grace of decades in the spotlight, each gesture calculated yet effortless. The makeup artist had already covered the lines around his eyes, but nothing could hide the weariness that had settled into his shoulders like an old coat. Through the thin walls separating the main showroom from the hotel's smaller carousel room, muffled sounds drifted in, amateur voices, nervous laughter, the charitable talent shows that Atlantic City hotels hosted to polish their community image. Frank had performed in venues like this when he was nothing more than a skinny kid with big dreams and bigger debts. Now, 3 decades later, he commanded stages that those hopeful performers could only dream of. The dressing room buzzed with its usual pre-show ritual. His valet steamed wrinkles from his backup shirt, while his pianist, Bill Miller, ran through chord progressions on a portable keyboard in the corner. The familiar scent of Old Spice aftershave mixed with cigarette smoke and the faint smell of whiskey from the flask Jilly kept hidden in his jacket pocket. This was Frank's sanctuary, the eye of the hurricane that was his public life, where he could exist for a few precious minutes as just a man preparing for work. His bodyguard, Jilly Rizzo, poked his head through the door. 15 minutes, Frank. The crowd's already liquored up and ready. Frank nodded, running his fingers through his silver hair one last time. The charity show next door was supposed to end before his performance began, but the schedule had run long. Amateur shows always did, nervous performers taking too long between acts, forgotten lyrics stretching songs into awkward eternities. That's when he heard it, a young voice no more than 10 years old, beginning the opening notes of My Way. The kid's voice was untrained but sincere, each word delivered with the raw, honest emotion that reminded Frank why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, listening as the boy navigated the familiar melody that had become Frank's signature, his personal anthem, the song that defined his entire approach to life and career. Then the crowd's energy shifted. What had been polite applause dissolved into snickers, then outright laughter. Frank's expression hardened as he recognized the sound, the cruel amusement of people who found entertainment in someone else's vulnerability. Tommy's singing faltered but persisted, each note now fighting against a rising tide of mockery that seemed to grow with each passing second. Poor kid, Jilly muttered, checking his watch. Maybe we should... Quiet. Frank held up his hand, his ear pressed toward the wall. The laughter was getting louder, more vicious. Someone in the crowd shouted something that made others cackle with the vicious, mean-spirited glee that Frank had encountered too many times in his own career. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, his knuckles white against his tan skin. The boy kept singing, his voice quieter now, but resolute, refusing to surrender to the cruelty washing over him from the audience. Frank turned away from the mirror, his mind flooding with memories he'd spent years trying to bury. The rustic cabin in 1939, when the audience had booed him off stage after just 2 songs. The critics who'd called him a washed-up crooner during his dark period in the early 50s. The countless nights when he'd stood alone under harsh spotlights, feeling the weight of expectation and the sting of rejection in equal measure. But this was different. This wasn't some seasoned performer getting roughed up by a tough crowd. This was a child, probably performing for the first time in his life, getting destroyed by adults who should have known better. A knot formed in Frank's stomach as the boy's voice cracked on the high note of, "I did it my way," the phrase that had become Frank's personal anthem, now being used as ammunition for cruelty. Mr. S., his pianist, Bill Miller, appeared in the doorway. "Everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Frank hadn't realized how hard he was gripping the edge of his dressing table. His reflection stared back at him. but all he could see was that scrawny kid from New Jersey who'd been told he'd never amount to anything, who'd been laughed at by record executives and club owners who couldn't see past his unconventional looks and street-smart attitude. The laughter next door grew more vicious. Someone was actually clapping along mockingly to the boy's rhythm, turning the performance into a spectacle of humiliation. Frank's health had been fragile lately. His doctor had warned him about his blood pressure, told him to avoid stress. But this wasn't about his health anymore. This was about something deeper, an emotion that cut to the core of who Frank Sinatra had been before he became an icon. "You know what kills me?" Frank said quietly, his voice barely audible over the continuing mockery next door. "That kid's got more guts than half the performers I know. He's up there alone, no backup singers, no orchestra, just him and that song, and they're eating him alive." Jilly shifted uncomfortably. "Frank, your show starts in 10 minutes. Maybe we should just..." "Should what?" Frank's voice carried an edge that made everyone in the room go quiet. "Pretend it's not happening, let some kid get crucified because it's not our problem." He could hear his own voice getting louder, the anger building in his chest like steam in a kettle. The boy had stopped singing. For a moment there was complete silence from the carousel room, and Frank thought maybe it was over. Then he heard it, the sound of a child crying, trying to hold it together while an entire room full of adults sat in uncomfortable silence, probably wondering if they'd gone too far. Frank looked at his reflection one more time, seeing not the legend everyone expected him to be, but the man he'd always been underneath the spotlight and the swagger. The man who remembered what it felt like to be dismissed, discounted, and destroyed by people who held his dreams in their hands. The crying continued next door, soft but heartbreaking. Frank's hands slowly unclenched. His decision was made. Frank strode toward the connecting door with the determined intensity that his entourage had learned never to question. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished floor in measured beats, each step carrying 3 decades of experience and a lifetime of memories. Behind him, voices rose in alarm, his manager, his bodyguards, his musicians, all scrambling to understand what was happening. "Mr. S, you can't just..." his manager started, but Frank was already pushing through the door that separated the main showroom from the carousel room. The carousel room was packed with families, local dignitaries, and hotel guests who'd wandered in for free entertainment. On the small stage, illuminated by harsh overhead lights, stood a boy who couldn't have weighed more than 80 pounds. His cheap suit hung loose on his narrow frame, and tears carved visible tracks down his flushed cheeks. In his trembling hand, he held a microphone that seemed too big for him. The cord coiled at his feet like a snake. The moment Frank's silhouette appeared in the doorway, the room transformed. Conversations died mid-sentence. Someone's drink glass clinked against a table as they set it down too hard. A woman in the front row actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as recognition dawned across the audience like sunrise. Frank Sinatra, the Frank Sinatra, standing in their little charity talent show like some kind of apparition. The boy on stage noticed the shift in the room's energy before he saw Frank. His crying had quieted to soft hiccups, but his face remained a mask of humiliation and confusion. He looked out at the suddenly silent crowd, then followed their collective gaze to the back of the room where Frank stood, still as a statue, taking in the scene. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered near the bar. "That's really him." Frank began walking down the center aisle, his movements fluid despite the tension radiating from his frame. The crowd parted instinctively, chairs scraping against the floor as people scrambled to get out of his way. His blue eyes were locked on the boy, who had gone completely still, the microphone dangling at his side. "What's your name, kid?" Frank's voice filled the room easily. That unmistakable baritone cutting through the silence like a knife through silk. The boy's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Frank climbed the 3 steps to the stage with practiced ease, and suddenly the small platform felt even smaller with both of them on it. Up close, the kid looked small for his 10 years, with freckles across his nose and hair that stuck up in the back where he'd probably been nervous sweating. "Tommy!" the boy finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. "Tommy!" Frank nodded as if filing the name away somewhere important. He turned to face the audience, his presence immediately commanding the room in a way that needed no introduction, no fanfare. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, until people began shifting in their seats and clearing their throats. I was listening from next door, Frank said, his voice conversational, but carrying clearly to every corner of the room. Kid's got real talent. His hand found Tommy's shoulder, and the boy looked up at him with a mixture of awe and terror that Frank recognized from his own childhood encounters with figures who seemed larger than life. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing a miracle or about to be subjected to a legendary Sinatra temper tantrum. Frank let the silence hang in the air, his hand remaining steady on Tommy's shoulder as he surveyed the crowd with the steely intensity that had made grown men in Vegas casinos sweat. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and someone's nervous cough from the back row. "You know," Frank began, his voice carrying the same intimate quality that had made him famous in smoky nightclubs decades ago, "I was about this kid's age when I first got up on a stage. Hoboken, 1935, amateur night at the local theater." His eyes moved across the audience, making contact with individuals, drawing them into the story. Crowd wasn't much different from you folks, looking for some entertainment, maybe a few laughs. Tommy looked up at him, still clutching the microphone but no longer crying. The boy's shoulders gradually relaxed under his touch. "Thing is," Frank continued, "they laughed at me too, called me all sorts of names. Skinny, ugly, said I'd never amount to nothing." A slight smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Guess they were wrong about that last part." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience, but Frank's expression remained serious. "But here's what I learned that night, and every night since." His voice grew quieter, forcing everyone to lean forward to hear him. "It takes guts to get up here, real guts, more guts than most people got. And when somebody has that kind of courage, the least we can do is show a little class in return." He turned back to Tommy, whose eyes were wide with something approaching wonder. "What do you say we finish this song together, pal? Show these nice people how it's really done?" Tommy nodded frantically, bringing the microphone back up with shaking hands. Frank hummed the opening bars of "My Way," his voice low and warm, giving the boy time to find his rhythm again. When Tommy began to sing, his voice was still thin and untrained, but it carried a new confidence that hadn't been there before. Frank joined him on the second verse, his legendary voice wrapping around Tommy's like a protective embrace. The contrast was striking. The weathered perfection of a master craftsman supporting the raw, honest emotion of a child who simply loved to sing. Together, they navigated the familiar melody, Frank's voice never overwhelming Tommy's, but lifting it, making it stronger. As they reached the final verse, Frank stepped back slightly, letting Tommy take the lead on "I Did It My Way." The boy's voice soared on the last note, no longer fighting against the crowd, but singing for them, with them. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous, not the polite recognition of charity donors, but the genuine appreciation of people who had witnessed an extraordinary moment. Frank leaned down, his mouth close to Tommy's ear. "Listen to me, kid," he whispered, his words meant for Tommy alone. "Don't let anybody ever tell you that you can't sing. You keep practicing, you keep getting up on these stages, and someday, you'll be the one teaching some scared kid that it's okay to dream big." Tommy's eyes filled with fresh tears, but these were different. Tears of joy, of possibility, of a moment that would define the rest of his life. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal microphone, the gold-plated Shure that had traveled with him to every major venue in the world. "This is yours now," he said, pressing it into Tommy's hands. "But I got one condition. Promise me you'll never stop singing, no matter who tries to tell you different." Tommy nodded, clutching the microphone like it was made of pure magic. Frank straightened up, gave the boy's shoulder one last squeeze, and walked off the stage to another round of applause that seemed to shake the building's foundation. As he disappeared back through the connecting door, Frank Sinatra left behind more than just a microphone. He left a room full of people who had witnessed the difference between performance and humanity, between stardom and grace. And somewhere in that crowd, Tommy stood alone on the stage, still holding Frank's microphone, understanding for the first time that dreams weren't just possible, they were worth fighting for.